Yo, dude, I've been reading this book called The Regeneration, and it's by this dude named Paul Hawken, and like, it's all about like regeneration's like, kind of like recreating all that was lost, and how like humans and nature, we have to come together, right, to like power, like change and make this happen. And so I made a song. Like I think it could be like the anthem. Let me show you, man. I'll show you the song really quick on here, real fast.
What's that?
Oh, yo, this is the battery to it, bro. Like, I actually power, this is solar, and I store energy in batteries, and that's why it's called the battery tour. And I use it to power all my concerts. And I also made the whole album, all this music I'm making, off of renewable energy, off of this thing. So here, let me show you, dude. I'll just like walk you through the record, because like you gotta really feel the lyrics and stuff. And it's all about changing the world, right? And if anyone's listening, they just, it's the vibe, you know what I'm saying? You feel me, bro?
Oh, sister, mister, look who's made our minds up.
We can't make our minds up, we gotta come together.
Now I can't find the reasons not to give up.
All the change makers, we can't give up,
Teachers, leaders, dreamers, let's go. They always take the right away, leave the building, make you bed. We can change the world. Is that a lie they told us? We can change the world. We'll shine a light back on us. We can change the world. So we got to come together now. We got to come together now. Got to come together. See, I don't like it any more than you do.
But everyone's ignorant,
In your
sometimes, right?
ignorance, that bliss is
We
for.
can't avoid these issues, we gotta come together.
So it's about time we humble and realize that we are one and the same, unique and one of a kind. 'Cause brighter days come ahead when we join together. Put your best foot forward, go and make an effort. This is AY, I spoke to Akon, Marvin gave me in the grapevine. Let's have a great time, let's change the world, influence great minds. I'm trying to paint my version
I'm
of
just trying to
Picasso.
change the world
This is
and bring it together,
colossal.
So
they always take the right away, leave the building, make it big. We can change the world. Is that a lie they told us? We can change the world. We'll shine a light back on us. We can change the world.
Yo, yeah, I know. I mean, I think it can be like an anthem for something, right? Like, I'm telling you, everybody's an outlet. If we can all just take a step toward regeneration, we can make it happen. Yeah, that's it, man.
I know we're jaded. I know we get complacent. We're losing feelings.
All right. So welcome everybody to the Regeneration Dialogue with Paul Hawken and friends. And that was, you saw just a brief excerpt of the regeneration.org website. There are lots of resources we're putting in the chat, so check them all out. And that set us up for Regenerative Spirit. Thank you for joining us for this forum series. And before we begin the rest of the session, just a few logistical items. We're on a Zoom webinar, so your audio and video will remain off for the duration of the webinar. Please direct questions to the Q&A box below, and we'll be monitoring those and including your questions later in our discussion. And we're recording this, so you have an opportunity to look at this again. If there's anything you missed, and pass it on to your friends at www.garrisoninstitute.org. This online event today is part of a continuing series of Garrison Institute's forum on pathways to planetary health. And we see that there are 4 pathways, and they all are included in this magnificent subject of regeneration. The first is we have to preserve half the Earth's biodiversity. The second is everything we build, buy, the way we make energy has to be part of an ecological civilization. We have to transform our economy to regenerative economy, and we need to do this all with a sense of expanded self that supports the common good. Today's session is sponsored by Volans, Urbem, Sustainable Hudson Valley, Planetary Health Alliance, the Green Swans Observatory, the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, and the Force of Nature. And we really appreciate all of you. So today, our guests are going to be Mimi Casteel, who's the winemaker at Hopewell Wine and Vineyard in Salem, Oregon. And just to make sure that she was as great as everybody says she is, I bought some of her wine, and it is really extraordinary. And the way that she's making the wine is really wonderful. We're going to hear more about that. John Elkington, who's an expert on corporate responsibility and sustainable capitalism. And he has been, for his young years, he's been doing this for a very long time. He's really an elder in the corporate responsibility community. He's the chief pollinator at Volans. Clover Hogan is a climate activist and a researcher on eco-anxiety, and the founder and executive director of Force of Nature, a youth not-for-profit mobilizing the mindsets for climate action. And we know that the way the climate problem came from the nature of mind as socialized across our current culture, and that we're only going to solve this if we change our minds. Lyla June is an Indigenous public speaker, artist, scholar, and community organizer of the Diné people. And also the Tetsutratahetse, which I didn't pronounce properly, but is the Cheyenne people and European lineages from Dallas, New Mexico. And Paul Hawken is the author of his new book, Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation. And it is around this extraordinary book and the website and the ideas that are all encapsulated in it that we are gathered today. So hello, everybody, and hello, audience. We are so delighted that you could join us. So Paul, there were two things. When we actually started this conversation a long time ago about this book, and then about the idea of actually doing something, literally 2 years ago, you wrote me the following. So I want to read that and then get your thoughts. Regeneration recreates what has been lost. It applies to all life on Earth: grasslands, farms, insects, forests, fish, wetlands, coastlands, oceans. It applies equally to our own life, who we are, and what we do in communities, cities, where we worship, schools. I can go on and on and on. But it's about a very inclusive view. You say that vital connections have been severed between human beings and nature, within nature itself, and between people, religions, and cultures. This severance is the origin of our climate crisis. It's the root. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for inviting all of us. I'm looking forward to the conversation, especially listening. Those are my thoughts. You just read them. But their deeper thought is that regeneration is our true nature. As a human being, as a life form. Regeneration is innate to all life. Regeneration is the default mode of life. And it is also the active mode of being a human being, because all 30 trillion cells are regenerating every nanosecond, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. And so, but we think of regeneration in a social sense or in an active sense. We think about how we take care of ourselves, how we take care of our children, our family, our friends, our community, how when we go to places of worship, whether a synagogue or mosque or temple or church or whatever and so forth, that's very much a caring activity, a caring and the sublimation of self to the larger whole, and with respect to devotion, prayer, compassion, generosity, charity in a Christian sense. And all that is all the expression of regeneration. And what I wanted to do was to actually provide the climate movement, if you will, or the movement to reverse global warming with bigger arms, with a bigger language, with a larger sense of inclusion, because I feel like the language around climate is very male-dominated, first of all. It's very othering. It's full of acronyms, jargon, metrics, measurements, I mean, and all of which actually leave people cold. They don't, I mean, if you doubt that, go down to be the woman or man in the street with a fake microphone and ask people, what does 1.5C mean to them? And they'll look at you like you're odd, at least. But it goes further than that, because the language we use about fighting, combating, tackling, conquering, and so forth, climate change, and Bill Gates is about fixing it, quote, quote, it. There's no it there.
Mm.
And so that what it does is it creates the illusion, the delusion really, that climate is out there somewhere, that we can do something to it, instead of understanding that actually it's an expression, it's a result of the interaction between us and the biosphere, and that the atmosphere and the biosphere are the same thing. One's solid, one's gaseous. We denote them differently, but it's no different than our human body. We are part solid and part gaseous, and we're a human being. And so it's not a matter of fixing it. Nature never makes a mistake. We do. And basically, we should look at this as being homeschooled by planet Earth. And lesson number one is to be in alignment with life.
Mm. So you also said social justice is not a sideshow to the climate crisis. Social justice is the cause of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because to me, it's almost, it's not patronizing, but it's a little bit patronizing to say, oh yeah, and by the way, people living in low-lying lands or people who are marginalized communities, and so forth, are paying the highest price too. There's no question about that. But then it doesn't go to first cause. It goes to symptomatics. And so it's another way of colonist mind, settler mind, whatever you want to call it, but the dominant paradigm, to basically look at it as something that's happening, as if one's actions, activity, mind, thinking didn't have anything to do with it, and now we have it on our hand, and oh my gosh, look at this injustice it's causing, and which is again true, and we should pay attention to it hugely and so forth. But what I'm trying to say in regeneration, that actually the so-called, there's no poor people in the world. There's people living in poverty. There's a difference. And that we have to understand that it's almost a Buddhist point of view, it is interbeing and in the sense of inseparability from all life. But if we don't understand that meeting current human needs is actually the pathway to reversing global warming, then I feel like we've kind of missed the prize. We've missed the treasure that's there for us, which is, it's not about fixing it, it's about fixing us. And one of the things that needs to be fixed about us is the way we're treating each other.
And that comes from a worldview. So Lyla June, I'd love to bring you in. And you've spoken about non-duality and dual and two-ness. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. So there is a unwhole worldview from which biodiversity loss and climate change has emerged from. So I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts about that, and what might be some of the pathway back in.
Yeah, I really appreciated what Paul was just saying, like focusing on, these poor people who are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, instead of centering the ways in which settler society has generated those inequities. And sort of the difference between saying stop Asian hate and stop American racism. The latter is my preference, because it's not centering Asian folks as the problem. It's actually us as Americans. We're the problem, like non-Asian Americans that that is coming from. So, but yeah, I guess for me, I really appreciate that too, because also in these poor communities, as Paul and I have talked about, is some of the most important solutions to our crisis. For example, my doctoral work is really focused on indigenous food systems and the ways in which Native folks here created incredibly complex food systems prior to Columbus's arrival, and sort of debunking the primitive Indian myth, this idea that there was just a few of us scattered around, eating hand to mouth, eking out a living on the land, and really unearthing research that's already been done and is continuing to be done to say, no, indigenous peoples densely populated what we now call the Americas. We were and still are highly organized and highly complex societies. Our languages were arguably much more rich and you could say a lot more than with English. You could discuss different matters that you just can't say in English. Like, for instance, we have a word for a young woman who has had her first blood. It's called kinalta, and so she is the kinalta, and we drop everything for 4 days and we celebrate her. So why don't we have a word for a young girl who's had her first blood, her first menstruation cycle? What are the impacts ecologically when we don't honor that blood and honor that woman and lift her up, instead of saying, here's a tampon, shh, go over here and don't tell anyone. You know what I'm saying? What does that mean? So these marginal communities are definitely holding some of these incredible keys to not only healing themselves, but arguably healing the rest of our world as well. And so my focus has been on that. But to answer your question, I really think that is the path towards really creating, and I could go, I'm sure I will have time to go into more details of that. But I think another thing you're getting at, because we talked about this the other day, is an indigenous concept, well, rather an indigenous experience, that collapse can be our greatest teacher. That maybe gets into your non-duality question, is this idea of like good and bad and oh no, but really for our nations, collapse was the thing that grew us, that evolved us, that honed us and sharpened our ability to be human, because we were basically shown how patriarchy doesn't work, human supremacy doesn't work, caste systems don't work. And I'll just give you a brief example. In New Mexico, or what is now called New Mexico, where I'm from the Diné Nation. There's Chaco Canyon. It's an archaeological ruin. And all the archaeologists are scratching their heads saying, well, what happened here? They just, everyone vacated the spot around this certain time period. And what our elders say is that, we started playing God there. We started developing caste systems there. Don't get me wrong, it was an amazing place, but we started doing all kinds of things that were not ours to do. We were exhausting resources. We created caste systems there. The lower people, quote unquote, would build for the higher priests. And Creator sent us a drought, an environmental crisis, a catastrophe. And they say that Creator sent us that drought to give us the courage to change. And so in that way, I really feel as though this crisis is tragic, don't get me wrong. And it is about the only thing that will give us the courage to change, because we've had warnings for decades and haven't done a thing.
Mm. So, it's interesting, your work in food systems. There's a very interesting man who is likely to be the next mayor of New York, Eric Adams, an African-American former policeman. And, when people run for higher office, they write a book that tell the people about what they're going to do differently. And his book is about becoming a vegan. And what he said was that one day he woke up almost blind and he was diagnosed with diabetes, onset diabetes. And after, looking at all the medicine to treat the symptoms, he decided to go to the root cause, and he became a vegan. Within 3 weeks, his eyesight was back, and, he's totally healthy now. And as he really looked into it, what he discovered was that from his point of view, the African-American diet was a slave diet. It was actually, the pig knuckles and all that stuff, all that bad food was kind of what was left to his people because of their original conditions in the United States. And so he said, if we're going to regenerate our society, regenerate our personal health, and regenerate our whole health, we have to go back to the earlier systems of food systems, which are the Native American systems, which were really grounded in a holistic view of health that incorporated the health of the earth. So humans can be gardeners, where they actually can increase biodiversity and richness. So Mimi, I'd love you to talk about being a gardener of the soil and a gardener of nature and the gardener of the system.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be with all of you today. And to me, wine, if it is powerful and if it does have a role, it's because it is one of the best metaphors for how we view our relationship to life. And because when you make wine, you are taking, your relationship that you've had with the land and all of the time that came before, and you're putting yourself into that moment of harvest. And then there's a transformation of all of that energy into something that is a timestamp of love of place and all of the things that make it what it is when it's in its best form. And it lives and breathes and becomes a story for people to enjoy and for people to commune with. And I think that is the true honoring of what the earth brings us every year. And when we look at it as a community in a moment, in a place that can't be replicated, then you create something that is truly special and makes a mark on the world. But obviously it's a lot of other things too. And I just try to focus on, the work that we do to bring something beautiful to life every year. And beyond that, how we do that work matters as much as the work itself.
The how we do the work matters as much as the work itself. And it's it's the mindset. You used a beautiful word, which is relational. And it really is a relational practice. So Clover, you are building a movement, and your movement is grounded in nature. So talk about relationality and how it ties to your work.
Thank you for the conversation so far and for the great question as well. So much of my work at Force of Nature really exists at this intersection between what goes on internally, so from a mindset and mental well-being perspective, and what is currently breaking down in the world around us. So the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and some of the really irrational responses to the challenges that are particularly defining my generation. And what we're seeing in all of our conversations and all of our research is this real rise of what has been kind of termed eco-anxiety. So feelings of stress and frustration and anger, and I think particularly in young people around the world, the sense of despair in response to these crises. And really that eco-anxiety, I mean, in the UK, it was found that over 70% of young people were feeling this way between the ages of 18 and 24. There was also some recent research that came out from a study that we contributed to with 10,000 young people around the world across 10 countries, where 56% of them said that when they think about the future, they see it as doomed. So we see lots and lots of people who are really shutting down in response to these crises. And yet what we've learned is that eco-anxiety is a perfectly natural and human response. In the same way we wouldn't want to outrun the climate crisis, we don't want to try and run away from those difficult feelings, as hard as they can be. because what we've learned is that those difficult feelings are the internal alarm bells that tell us something is seriously wrong. And we've seen that those internal alarm bells have been much more present in the communities for whom climate change, environmental racism, social injustice, the commodification of nature has already been their lived experience for many, many more decades than those of us living in a bubble of relative climate privilege. And so when that eco-anxiety, when those internal alarm bells go off, we owe ourselves, we owe the earth, and of course we owe frontline communities the duty to listen to those feelings and tune into those feelings as a kind of compass to think, okay, well, what are the problems that we need to solve? And in fact, how is the climate crisis not an issue of polar bears and solar panels, but really a symptom of interconnected problems with interconnected solutions? And so it is that division that we are working to kind of heal within Force of Nature, to really support, in particular through our work, young people to shift from a place of feeling that despair to feeling empowered to create that change. And critically, in supporting young people through that shift, then use the velocity and momentum of those feelings to change people in historic seats of power, often our parents who are in those existing seats, decision makers, to actually shift the institutional mindset away from the incrementalist approach that we're currently seeing define the climate conversation.
Wow. So one of the most important things we can shift, John, is the force of economics in business. Dan Goldman asked the question, what's the potential role of eco-transparency in products and economy and business in regeneration? So is transparency necessary or sufficient to create the change? Or tell us what you're seeing from the business side.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for the question. It's a complicated one. Hello, everyone. It's a wonder to be part of this conversation. I think transparency is fundamental. It's a necessary condition of everything. The problem is that we tend to use transparency in ways that suit us. So we shine the spotlight on things that we're happy to share with the world. So 30 years ago, I helped sort of launch the sort of corporate reporting movement, and there has been progress, and companies have understood a bit more about the issues, that they've understood a bit more about their supply chains and so on, but they're not really setting what they're reporting typically in the wider context of the context that is in Paul's book, the context that is in all of your work. And in some ways, I mean, they might argue, well, I suspect they wouldn't, but that it would almost be like taking LSD, that if you got to that level of consciousness and you're reporting on all of that complexity in the wider world, you're going to drown yourself and you're going to drown anyone that you're trying to communicate with, particularly investors, which is one of the reasons. I mean, something over 30 years ago in 1991, I got a Financial Times journalist, Ingram Pinn, to draw me a cartoon, which has sort of come to define the work that I and my colleagues have done, which is focusing on boards. It's focusing on top teams and business. And around that boardroom table, there was a fish wearing a business suit that was sort of representing the natural world. There was a woman who was very conspicuously from what we might once have called the third world, representing the dispossessed, the poor, and so on. And there was a robot. And the robot had a 3001 shoulder flash, and the idea was that was for the long-term future. That was a couple of years before I came up with the triple bottom line. So that was the first stab at that. And I think if you're viewing this from the point of view of a business leader, you are clearly wanting to be in conversation with the wider world, particularly now everyone is talking about stakeholder capitalism, and you thought you were doing shareholder capitalism. But then the question is, who do you invite to the party? I mean, again, for many years, I've worked, as Paul and others here have done, with companies as they try and invite in the wider world. And it used to be Oxfam and Greenpeace and people like that. And now, who is it? I mean, is it all the young people in the world? Or is it, and I think so. Transparency, crucial to your question, absolutely necessary condition, absolutely not a sufficient condition, probably for anything. And the one link I'd do back to the cartoon is that at the time when I put the robot at the end of the table, that was a sort of joke. I mean, it was, who'd imagine a world where robots would sit at the table? 2014 in Hong Kong, the first expert system was appointed to a board. And I think we're going to need artificial intelligence. And Salesforce has been working on a suite or family of expert systems called Einstein. And I think the problem is that people at these top tables in business, in financial institutions and so on, are now facing so much complexity that their training and their competences just don't equip them to do what is needing to be done. Maybe younger people, if we shunted them all up onto boards instantaneously, could do it because they're native in this wider world. But I suspect not. I think these are complex challenges that people need to be trained for and equipped to deal with. So yeah, but on the balance, I'm very optimistic. I think that the business is finally getting the systemic element of all of this. Loops back to the question about transparency. They still don't know how to share that with the wider world, but they are beginning to get it.
Thank you. So Paul, the question of what's the training, what do we need to know, is something that you had to figure, and how do we need to think about it? How do we think about what we need to know, which is something that's emerged from everybody's statements, is something you had to figure out when you put together this book. You had to figure out what was in it, what was not, and how, and what was the story that each of the cells within the body of the book collectively told. So walk us through that a little bit, your thought process in bringing this together, and walk us through what some of the elements are.
Well, in considering the book, I go back to language because as I said, I feel like the way climate has been languaged, and I realize language is not a verb, but nevertheless has been communicated, has been maybe well-intended and sincere, but completely inept when you think about it. And it arose originally from scientism, and then it morphed over into activism. So the activism, scientism sort of combination of guilt, shame, blame, fear, threat, all these mix, stir well. And then, and what that does to the human mind is to go right to the amygdala and go right to fight or flight or freeze. And we know what that does to, from a neuroscientist point of view, neuroscience point of view. And so I was thinking about language, and the obvious thing to say at the beginning of such a book called Regeneration would be that everything is connected. And that's such a tired cliche, and it's absolutely true, both. But when you say it's all connected, it's like, thank you for sharing. It doesn't really communicate. And so what I tried to do is create stories, narratives about challenges and solutions, and bring in storytellers like Lyla June and Carl Safina and Isabella Tree and others. And that if you read them specifically, even standalone, what you'll see is that they're making connections that you hadn't thought of before. They're not saying everything is connected, they're saying this is connected to that. I mean, Isabella Tree's work with Charlie Burrell in Sussex, they have the first nesting pair of storks in over 600 years. I mean, it's like, huh? How? What did that happen? What did they do? In other words, what happens, you create the conditions in which people start to make connections themselves. And so the book itself was edited and authored mostly by me, but in such a way as to create the spaciousness for people to start to make those connections, as opposed to telling them that it's all connected. And so and it's broken into sectors, obviously, forests and oceans and wilding and food and cities and energy, etc. But within that, the central thing is really in the center of the book, literally, is people. And what that says is, if we want to know what to do, listen to those who pay the highest price. And we know that's, that's the localized poor, that's children, that's women, that's indigenous people. I mean, if we ask, they'll tell us. They know. It's not like, oh, we don't know what to do. Yes, we do. but that those who as Clover so eloquently put, I mean, they live in their own self-contained bubbles and they don't realize it, and they can't actually reach out. The boardroom that John created, or the cartoon of one, is a perfect example, and so forth. I mean, all of us have been on boards, maybe we are bored, but we know how isolating they really are, and so the book was, again, and the book is really, I consider to be a neurotransmitter, which is to basically try to awaken people to possibility, because the world is drowning in the probability of what's going to go wrong, when and how it's going wrong faster than we thought it was in the first place. And what we all lack, and I say especially those who are younger, is a sense of the possibilities that these probabilities actually offer and engender. And so the book I consider to be a neurotransmitter. The last 8 pages is, to mix my metaphors very badly, is a wormhole to the website. And the website is really what the book's about. It's sort of odd. Usually it's an afterthought. It's not. The website is what it's about, and the core of that is what's called Nexus, and it is a listing, a network, the world's largest listing and network of climate challenges and solutions, and how to get them done. Because when I started Drawdown in 2014, there was no list of solutions at all. I mean, there was some here and there. There are almost proverbial solutions, like, eat smart and move closer to work and buy a different car and put a power strip in your home entertainment center. Really, that was a Union of Concerned Scientists, to put a power strip in your home entertainment center in 2016. It's like, what are you talking about? And so that's why Drawdown was created, but it was really the first time we mapped, measured, and modeled the most substantive solutions is what we could do. It didn't tell you how to do it. And so the website in Regeneration this is how you get it done. And so each of those solutions, when you click on them, there's 150 links to people who are doing it, who know it, who understand it, who are on the ground in the city, and who will share, need support, where you can influence what Clover's talking about. Where are the centers of power? Who are the bad actors that need an email directly to them, and here's their phone number? We give the email and phone number of the head of JBS. I know probably they'll change it when the book's out too long, but say, you want to stop soy from the Amazon, JBS, meat, and so forth. I mean, this is where you do it. That's already affected one of the largest universities in the country, who now has called up JBS and said, wait a minute, we can't buy your meat anymore if you're involved with the Amazon and deforestation and so forth. So this is what Nexus is. And then it's connected to climate action systems, which is learning pods that you can form and share to learn how to electrify your house or your neighborhood. And that's connected to the Regenerators Network that Damon Gameau is doing 2040. And it goes on and on. I mean, John and Volans and Clover are active partners. And I have to say, we're making this up as we go along. It's not like we know what to do. We don't. But we know what needs to be done, and how we need to create a movement that's, if I say inclusive, it's almost like, who am I to say it is or isn't inclusive? It's actually to embody a sense of a connection, instead of saying, oh, we're going to be inclusive. It's like, oh, kind of cringeworthy statement. It's kind of like what Lyla said, Asian hate or stop racism. I mean, let's go upstream. And so what we're trying to do is break down the walls of normal websites. The sort of walls. You have links, of course, and technically sort of interpenetrating each other and so forth in terms of possibilities, what is known, connections, solutions, activities, people, organizations, teachings, all that sort of stuff. So that when you go in, you go into the world of regeneration, because it's a burgeoning movement. We didn't invent it. We didn't create the word. We didn't coin it. This is a burgeoning movement. And I think John can speak to this too because of his vast experience in terms of sustainability and triple bottom line and so forth. And that is that he and I have commented that we've never seen anything expand and grow so fast, which is both heartening and worrying in terms of the word itself. Somebody asked me the other day, "Is you worried about the word being co-opted?" I said, "I'm not worried at all about that. It already has been, you know."
So it's very interesting that the book is a gateway to the website. I just want to counter one thing that you said about the Union Concerned Scientists who said putting a power strip on your home entertainment center. I think is a very powerful tool if you turn it off and never turn it on, not for the energy use, but for the ideas that you'll stop from flowing. Because, you know, the way we are acting in the world is really the result of an ecology of ideas that are self-reinforcing in a destructive direction.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, do you have to buy a home entertainment center to put a power strip on it? That's my point. You know?
Yeah.
It's like, who has a home entertainment center in the world? That's so crazy. You know?
Yeah. So, but what we do have is social media. I mean, we are actually, so it's funny, I have this phrase, the cognitive ecology. And I'd love any of you who want to comment on this, including Paul. But so we live in this state of connected mind. In Lyla June, if you think about what was the state of collective mind in 1491, it was a very different one from what happened after 1492. And as going forward, Clover, what we're seeing now is this connected mind is not only about who we are when we gather with other people and work together, or John, when we are part of companies and their customers, but it's a social media mind too. There's this whole new layer that we've added. So I'd love any of your thoughts about this social media mind and how can it be used?
Yeah, I can have a go at that. Well, I like to think back about, for instance, Jesus, and every time I get discouraged that Facebook is muffling my posts because they're too political, which there was a Wall Street Journal that just came out he just openly said we're going to be muffling political posts. So whenever I get discouraged that this platform that arguably got me to where I am in terms of visibility, which was social media, also has that power to take that away from me and actually has been leveraging that. But additionally, like I think about, Christ didn't have a Facebook page, it was 2000 years ago. Muhammad didn't have a Facebook page. And so I like to believe that, MLK didn't have a Facebook page. I like to believe that if we have a message that needs to get out there, that Creator will find a way for it to get out there, and that we do not have to depend on people like Zuckerberg to be the gatekeepers of who gets heard and who doesn't. But going back to your idea of like the cognitive ecology, or some people call it the collective unconscious, I think that there absolutely is such a beautiful, Paul was talking about the biosphere and the atmosphere. I think there's also something that Western science hasn't been able to understand very much, which is a spirit sphere, a sphere where all of us, no matter who we are, our ancestors were in deep connection with this sphere, and we're praying with this sphere and working with this sphere. And so my ideal cognitive ecology has nothing to do with Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, actually, because those things have become so corrupted, in my opinion. But to have us go back to that cognitive ecology where we are connected through prayer, we are connected through making relationships, we're connected through our own ways of communicating via song, just like that beautiful song we opened up with, Paul's Regeneration anthem. What was his name? A7 something. AY Young.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, like I want to believe that these internet tech giants have our best, or I know they don't have our best interest in mind, actually, but I want to believe we could still use these capillaries anyways. I want to believe that despite the hegemonic, you know, techno juggernaut, that thing that this thing has become, we can still reach each other through these avenues, and we do all the time. And at the same time, I think we need to build up either a people's cognitive ecology where it's not owned in the normal CEO top-down way, and also to start rebuilding the myofascial tissue between our minds and our hearts and our spirits that used to happen through ceremony, through prayer in the morning, offering cornmeal in the morning, offering mugwort in the morning, whatever your culture, whatever traditional plant thrives where your ancestors lived, you know, to offer that in the morning and speak to those spirits and speak to each other through those spirits. And I think that is what our ancestors used to do. And I think it's completely, if not more, efficient and capable of doing what we need to do than Facebook, for example.
Mm. Anybody want to follow that?
As the token Gen Zer in the room, I'm happy to share a perspective from someone who got Facebook when they were 9 years old and has very much grown up with these platforms. So on the one hand, obviously we can see the destructive nature of social media. I think in many ways it's a kind of reflection of the broader extrinsic values that seem to reign supreme in our society today. You know, extrinsic values are around comparison and competition. If I go on Instagram, everything is about comparing myself to the next person. It's about pushing away difficult feelings and instead just showing a very rose-tinted window into how wonderful my life is. I'm constantly being marketed to by different companies that are trying to prey on my insecurities, trying to sell me products that will make me beautiful enough, that will make me smart enough, that will make me feel good enough or keep up with the 52 fashion trends, right? So there's that element. And I think we see how obviously social media is contributing to the broader, you know, mental health crisis of young people who are growing up today. In relation to the climate crisis, you know, if you Google climate change, we're all very familiar with the kind of apocalyptic images, right, that have defined the cultural narrative around this crisis, the fires, the flooding, the droughts, etc. And in response to that, the proliferation of articles, which are, here are the 10 steps that you can take to solve climate change. You can turn the lights off when you leave the room. You can, get your reusable coffee cup, right? It's perpetuating a tokenized narrative of activism that has been a vested interest of fossil fuel industries, of lobbying parties to shame consumers, to put the onus on individual actions rather than talking about systemic change. So there's that element, which kind of portrays the negative picture. At the same time, I've seen the incredible connective power of social media. In the past couple of years, we've seen, the mobilizing of Black Lives Matter. We've seen the mobilizing of the youth strikes for climates. Every, protest that I've attended, every protest I've seen, they've been organized via Instagram DM and via WhatsApp and Facebook event pages, right? So it is the kind of connective tissue of my generation. And of course, we need to kind of bring care and attention to how we engage with it. But again, bringing this back to systemic problems with systemic solutions, we need to look at the interests of the people who create these platforms, exactly to Lyla's point, and put in policies and regulations in place so that they're not being used to prey on young people's minds. They're not being used to put in place political leaders who have an interest of keeping fossil fuel in power. And we need to think about what the power of them really can be, which is, from what I've heard, what the internet was created for, and it's just become a little bit misguided along the way.
What Lyla June talked about, prayer and gratitude for plants and a humbleness, in some ways is antithetical to the feeling tone of social media. I'm interested, I don't know if anybody has created another social realm that that features this other mindset, but it does feel like the inflammation of the earth, which is really in some ways what we're seeing, is coming from an inflamed culture that anyway, I heard what you said about the connectivity and how it's an organizing facility, etc. What's interesting is, can it be a nurturing facility? So Mimi, I'm gonna turn that to you in two ways. There's a very specific question from the audience as to how do you manage your vineyard regeneratively? What are the key challenges? And what kind of public support do you need to move forward? So I'd love you to take us back to the soil, but then I'd like you to take us forward, because you're making something that you need to you're not only making a wine, but you're making another way. You're trying to transmit a thought, a way of being in the making of wine. So I'd love you to answer this question again. So how do you actually manage your vineyard? And then talk about, how do you see using social media and others to change the mindsets?
Well, it's a great question. The answer how to the question, how do I manage my vineyard, is there's a very practical answer to that, which is fairly uninteresting, but I think the more tangible answer that relates to what we're talking about today is that the whole reason for the work is to basically prove out the boundaryless connection to everything. And I know that sounds very big and expansive, but to me, we have these notions of creating forward-bound complexity without the capacity to see beyond our immediate action. And what I love about working the land is that it strips all of that down to just this one place and the work that you're doing, and the do no harm concept that should apply to every action that we take in the world. If you would not extend a hand to any other person on earth, if you would not reach out and touch that person for whatever reason, then there's something that needs to heal within. And what I love about the work that we do here is that it is an exploration of how humans, as part of superorganism, can do work and create and transform without doing harm. And so first and foremost, the job that I do in the vineyard is try to create an environment that sustains and creates abundance, and then only take that one part that we will transform and make a story from there that people can understand, that they can commune with. Because I think that and the social media question is a hard one for me, because I have mostly in my current reality seen the damages of social media, and how, when we use it to its better ends to organize and try to affect change, there's still that sort of tension around, what you're putting out into the world, and it creates this sort of permanent energy. Whereas immediately, if you are out and you are taking, if you are taking the harvest, for example, or if you are feeding the earth back with the compost that you've generated for the last year or whatever, or your animals are out, turning that energy into something else, transforming it, that is immediate. It is real. It is part of a physical reality that we are incapable of truly understanding. And I like the focus of that work. And I think when we get into that mental space of creating forward bound complexity that we don't understand its implications in the world, usually that doesn't go well. And touching the people who are closest to you and who are touching your actions is the best way to understand what we're doing in the world. And that's very small and it's very insular, but I think that what's interesting about studying biology is that in a laboratory, we can do very reductive experiments to understand how such and such relates back to a physical law. But when it comes from taking a physical law into understanding the complexity of what we're creating in the world, we are totally inept. What our brains are capable of and how our brains have been designed is to immediately survive in a very, very, very challenging environment. And not 1 minute beyond that, really. And yet we act millions of years beyond that without the ability to even see how that's going to affect our next 5 minutes. And just being rooted in the ground, in the work, and understanding that everything you do has implications, and trying to focus your intention on doing no harm and creating abundance. That's where I think those things can come together harmoniously.
I love this idea of forward bound complexity, because that is evolution, is continually this forward bound complexity. And the idea of doing no harm, ahimsa, which is actually at the core of many religious traditions. But I actually think that we have many cultures from the past and many indigenous cultures today that they do know how to take action in ways that nurture. It's interesting. So when Darwin added in his 5th edition of I get the name of his book, but his The Origin of the Species, when he talked about the idea of the survival of the fittest, it got interpreted as like the fittest, but I actually think it means the fittest. And that if we always look at how things fit together, and then we imbue that view with care, that's where this can start. So there's a question for John in this. Somebody asked this beautiful question. In a talk last week, Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, commented on the current social status of corporations as persons. But neither animals nor plants nor water, and I'll add ecosystems, have such rights. Is there a movement or effort underway to address this privilege and the challenging that it creates? So John, the privilege that corporations have that life does not seem to have.
Well, I think it's a great question. It's an outrage and it's a travesty that there is this legal entitlement for corporations. There have been people talking about this for a very long time. If I go back sort of 30 years, there were books with titles like something like "Can Trees Have Standing?" in the legal sense. There are countries like New Zealand now which have given at least one river the equivalence of this sort of identity. And I think it's really, really important. I slightly worry, though, that if that's the route that we travel, so we do it all through lawyers and deeds and the rest of it, we're going to end up completely snarled up with, I have friends who are lawyers, but they're not my favorite profession, having been sued by a number of big corporations, including McDonald's. So I don't want to feed that particular beast. So the question in my mind would always be, can we have a legal foundation on which these things can be properly considered and really critical parts of ecosystems can be protected? But can we please do this as far as possible through sort of cultural dynamics rather than things I'll see you in court dynamics? But it's a wonderful question. I have not paid sufficient attention to it, but I do think it's something we should pay a lot more attention to.
So I want to give a little bit of the history of the legal dynamics. in 1970, the United States passed, the Congress overwhelmingly passed an environmental law called NEPA, which gave rise to environmental impact statements in the whole world. And NEPA was proposed by both the environmentalists and the developers. And it really creates the foundation to be able to sue to stop it. It's theoretically an assessment process, but it's all founded in the basis to able to sue to stop development. And the developers figured at that point they had a whole lot more lawyers than environmentalists, and that they would win in court. And the environmentalists, that environmental movement at that time really came out of a bunch of environmental lawyers. At the same time, there was another bill before Congress called the National Land Use Planning Act. And that was a bill that was supposed to look at whole systems. It came out of Scoop Jacks and a bunch of deep environmentalists. And its goal was to actually plan, where do we need to preserve? What are the ecosystems we need to preserve? And where could we rationally develop? And the developers were against it because it was going to stop development. The environmentalists were against it because it was going to allow some development in some places. And so they all chose to sue. So it's interesting. We actually made an intentional choice to sue our way out of problems rather than whole systems think our way out of problems. I hope that we're now at a point where we can rethink this choice. So I want to pass on another question to you, Paul, which is that regeneration.org lists actions and encourages action in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals and others. But this question asks, so those are external actions, and let's look at some internal qualities of human development. Do you see inner human development goals to help amplify strategies to align with the outer development goals?
Absolutely. One of the things you have to assiduously avoid when you write a book is not to try to do too much. And
come on,
cover too much ground, and it's just, the whole thing just sags, just like a souffle that just pancakes. And so you have to stick to your lane. Okay, you can be a big lane, but my lane there isn't inner development as such. Okay, now, having said that, I mean, if you parse the book carefully, it's there. In one way it's there. I was on a podcast for Tricycle with Sharon Salzberg as one of the interlocutors, and they were sort of noticing that. And I said, well, to tell the truth, it's stressful when you are in this theater of climate, and global warming. Every morning you get Feedly and RSS feeds, and I probably look at 100 or more, pieces, articles, peer-reviewed papers, headlines, and so forth about what's going wrong. And I only do that in the morning. I never do it at night. I wouldn't sleep. But nevertheless, it's like you're bathed in. You need to know the zeitgeist that you're speaking into or writing into. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And so I'd wake up pretty faithfully at around 4 in the morning. I'm going, God, I cannot get up now. I have to go back to sleep. And I would put on podcasts, and the podcasts were Jack Kornfield, who is on my board as well. And there's 133 of them. I know the exact number. I've heard them all more than once. I can finish his sentences now. I know it was good jokes, but it permeated my mind. And sometimes I go back to sleep in the middle of the podcast and so forth, but it literally informed me in a way that is subtle, I think, but also pervasive. And so, but to use, Buddhist language about interbeing and things like that would be totally inappropriate, and yet it's very, very appropriate to understand the inseparability and the beauty of where we live. But so the other thing is that just in terms of language, to try to make a book that's accessible to as many people as possible. And so that is about adverbs, it's about nouns, it's about sentence structure, and about creating an opening. And the thing is, there's many words and things that basically, as a friend of mine in Texas said, he's a ghostwriter, and he saw a book, and he said, Paul, he said, you all read this book? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, oh gosh, it's got a stop sign at the end of every sentence, you know? And so, and that's what happens when you use what I call borrowed language, you know? And so you have to be really careful the language is your own language coming from, you know, a faithfulness to the subject at hand, as opposed to getting out of your lane. And so, yes, absolutely, it's going to come from, and Lyla speaks to this so eloquently, but I know everyone here does, and that it comes from inner first, you know. But the inner is served by the honoring of what we call the outer, you know. And again, Lyla spoke to that as like, whatever that tradition may be, to honor that other sphere, you know, that there's different names for it and so forth. It isn't the biosphere as such, or the atmosphere, but and that prayer, that devotion, that sense of awe. There's a beautiful interview with Richard Powers, who wrote Overstory, and Ezra Klein at the New York Times. And Richard Powers is talking about his new book, Bewilderment. And he talks about something he didn't put in Bewilderment. This is getting pretty arcane now, aren't we? But he said what he didn't put in it, but thought to, was to have a father and son who are the heroes or the protagonists in Bewilderment, but have a father and son in some far away, distant planet, you know, and talking about the exoplanet they've discovered called Earth, you know, not we call Earth, they call it something else, you know, and his father's describing this to his son, what it does and how it works, and the water and the oceans and the 10 million species and the complexity of the interactions and so forth, and just the exquisite beauty of this place, this exoplanet. And his son says, oh, that must be science fiction. That's just science fiction. To inverse that, you know. And I feel like wherever that comes from, you know, I mean, the climate movement has to become a joyful expression of purpose if we're going to include and embrace it. And that's why that song is there, you know, from AY, you know, it's one of the most joyful, he's most joyful being I know, you know, but we have to actually make this something that brings us together, and we come together around dance and music and joy and art and kinship and celebration. You know, we don't come together, we can march, we can come together, but we don't come together in a steady, incremental, growing way around, you know, doom scrolling. And so really this movement, I think, really needs to shift. And what, you know, Clover is talking about, absolutely right. You know, people say, oh, it's so stressful. Exactly. Stress is the emotion that taught human beings to act. That's what it's for. It's not to just, you know, oh my God, that's so stressful. Maybe I should meditate. Yeah, do that too. But actually what it's doing is a signal for us to act. And so again, what Regeneration is about is do, go, act now. It's not about let's figure this out or let's do that. I mean, it's like, or somehow if I prepare myself and do something differently. And it comes from Andrew Huberman's work at Stanford, where he makes it very clear that our beliefs do not change our actions. You know, our actions change our beliefs, and they change the beliefs of others. And so for me, I'm just trying to point to a way of imagining oneself in the world and acting that is to the benefit of you, your family, your community, and all those who are here today and all those who will be here in the future and so forth, as a way of benefiting self instead of as altruism as per se. True altruism is actually the marriage of self to all other things.
Mhm. Melissa Everett asks, what are some of the most inspiring examples of action that you know that are scalable?
Me?
Yeah, you.
No, let's talk. Well, I mean,
We
I
can
would
go
tell,
ask everybody, but let's start with you.
well,
You just said we need to act. So
Oh yeah, we do need to act. One of the things I've never been to Mimi's Hopewell Farm. Okay,
yeah,
vineyard.
that's what.
And I've never been there, but I saw pictures of it because I was getting a picture of it for the book. And I saw this. I grew up in the valley, and my grandfather had a vineyard, so I know vineyards. And it was this vineyard, and it had what we call weeds growing everywhere, and animals, running around, looked like kind of the Noah's Ark of vineyards or something. And what's so beautiful about the weeds, and this goes back to my work in starting Erewhon and organic farming and so forth. And there's a beautiful book by Joseph Kokenauer called Weeds, and it was written in 1932 and printed by the University of Oklahoma Press. And what he pointed out is, if you really understand why a weed, which is a plant, not a weed, is there, it's there to heal the soil. It's emblematic of what the soil needs and what will change it. You have Canadian thistle, you have a calcium problem. Those roots are going down, those taproots are going down deep. You can't, I mean, so you have, pigweed, which is actually one of the most amazing crops in the whole world, amaranth, which was, first developed 7,000 years ago. It's an amazing food. All these things, and so forth. I saw the plants growing in, so people are intercropping in Mimi's vineyard. And I thought, oh my God, this is so beautiful, because it's really, again, it's about honoring and allowing, and as opposed to the scorched earth practices of industrial agriculture, which is really, about if we kill more life, you're going to get more life. That's the promise, and that hasn't been delivery. So what I'm inspired by it is not any one particular solution. Wilding, what Isabella Tree has done in Sussex, is stunning when you see how quickly nature will recover. It is unbelievable. In 20 years, to have more red-listed species on their 3,500 acre former farm than all the conservation areas in the entire UK. And they did it by,
just briefly tell
that's
the story
inspiring to me.
so that people understand the
Well,
story.
they got this, Charlie Burrell, his family goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, is, a baron, and what is he? John is, I think
he's royalty. He's titled. He's entitled.
He's titled. Yeah, he's titled, and he inherited this estate, and it skipped a generation. He didn't expect to. He was too young. Somebody in between was supposed to inherit it. He got it, and he and his wife Isabella, who's an extraordinary science writer, one of the best in the world, and they inherited a money-losing farm that contained this Sussex clay, which is perhaps the most intractable soil you can imagine. It's cement in the summer and glue in the winter, or vice versa, I forget which, but the point is they did everything they could to make this a profitable farm, and equipment and more inputs and so forth, and they ended up losing even more money. And so they met Frans Vera, an ecologist from the Netherlands, who basically was doing the opposite with land in the Netherlands, and pointed out what was the ecology of Europe, including the UK, 2,000 and more years ago. And it wasn't all forest, as been popularly put forth, but there was wide open spaces and forests, And he suggested that they basically ring fence it, take down all the internal fences, and put in 3 animals that were closest to the relatives of the animals that were there 2,000 years ago, the Tamworth pig and longhorn cattle and a type of horse. And that's what they did, and let it go. And today there are forests there that weren't there before. There's lakes that the pigs made, full of mussels that the pigs eat. I mean, it just came back to life, and none of it was introduced. And the species and the number of plants, and they have now safari tours, they have butterfly tours, that people come from all over to tour it just like it was a safari in Kenya. And when you see it, it's just a testament to regeneration itself, which is regeneration is something that we inhibit, prohibit, stop, curtail. And again, when I go back to Mimi and so forth, when you allow it, you get a terroir, you get a quality, you get a taste, And it's so interesting to me because wine is the spirit. So in a sense, you're allowing the spirit of the land go to the tongue, which is a most amazing reptilian projection we have, that actually is like the bouncer, at the nightclub saying, you're in, you're out, you're out. It is the first beautiful intelligence of our body saying, yes, you can come in, you cannot, and so forth. So I just love those connections, and every solution in the book inspires me, by the way.
So, by the way, for those who are interested, we've put in the chat a link to the NAP farm, and also a link to Jack Cornfield's meditations. One of the things I want to note is there's been very interesting work now. So the host of all this is the Garrison Institute, and we deeply believe in connecting contemplation and action. And there's a lot of work now in mindfulness and corporate mindfulness and mindfulness for eco-anxiety and mindfulness everywhere. And one of the things we're learning is that mindfulness actually doesn't really change a whole lot. It's the development of compassion, which is mindfully taking action in the world, that makes a difference. Clover, you're shaking your head. Talk more about this.
Okay, where to start? So something that is kind of proven in a lot of psychological frameworks around people's general satisfaction with life is not whether they feel more anxious or sad, but how they judge or choose not to judge that expression of feeling. And so something that came to mind as you were talking is the fact, again, that we're kind of living in a culture that promotes really a kind of like positivist psychology model of which is also embedded in those extrinsic values, right? So you should try to be happy all the time. You should try to achieve and be successful. You should try to climb the corporate ladder. If you feel anxious, if you feel sad, there's something broken within you, right? And so we lose all of the gifts that those feelings bring to us. And something that I'm very passionate about alongside eco-anxiety is ecophilia. So how do we foster our deep love, connectedness, and relationship to the natural world as expressions of nature? So just for some backstory, I grew up in a small town in tropical North Queensland in Australia, 6,000 people. Main industry was sugarcane farming. And on the weekends, my dad would go down with me to the mud flats and teach me how to catch huge mud crabs, like the size of a dinner plate. My sister would, come into the living room with a 2-meter long yellow python slung around her neck. Green tree frogs were everywhere. They were, on the ceiling, but also in the toilet bowl as well. So I was so privileged in that, I grew up in nature and where I had a living room with 3 walls. So there was not that division. And interestingly, I love to ask people, who are in the environmental, climate, and social justice spaces, what was that catalyst moment for you? And I remember John telling me the story of growing up and being out one evening and seeing the ground wriggling beneath him. And it was this eel migration, baby eels that were illuminated by the moonlight, and that sense of connectedness and awe. And I hear this story kind of echoed in so many people. So why I'm talking about this is because we have to, as much as we focus on the eco-anxiety, think about how we are actively cultivating, particularly in this emerging generation of young people, that deep respect for the natural world. And of course, for me, this is what is also at the heart of regeneration. It's very tempting to believe that techno-utopianism will solve this crisis, that we can, geoengineer ourselves out of climate change by pumping more chemicals into the sky or plastering over the issues. And yet the reality is, we can't solve this crisis if we continue to kind of double down on this divorce. And unfortunately, we live in a time and in a culture where it is easier to imagine life on terraformed Mars than it is to forge meaningful relationships with life here on Earth. And I think it's best captured by, Mark Fisher's famous quote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And that is why regeneration for me, and the incredible website, which I must say is the most beautiful website I've ever seen, regeneration.org. I won't be offended if you click off my face and go and have a look. It is that courage encapsulated of what it is to imagine what that world can look like, and not as a kind of hark back to the past, but what it can look like to live in a future where we live within planetary boundaries, and once again, where we don't sever ourselves from community and from the beautiful natural world that lives all around us.
Mm. So Lyla, talk about more, a lot of your work has to do with food systems. So, and it feels to me like food systems, so interesting. The climate movement really has focused a lot on energy systems, but it feels like energy systems touch people's economies, but food systems touch people's hearts and minds. So how do you see the combination of food systems and what you call the spirit sphere?
Well, first I want to echo what Clover said. These techno solutions are actually part of the problem, I think, and that's what I find with a lot of Eurocentric Western, outgrowths of European Enlightenment era. Is this pattern where our solutions are the problem, and that's where I think we just need to stop for a second and listen. But convincing Elon Musk to do that, I'm sure, will be very challenging. But in any case, I don't think food systems are different from energy systems. I think our energy comes from food. I think all of our food is transported by fossil fuels, by and large. I don't think they're as different as you might think. I think the localization of food systems actually is one of the, they did a study in the Midwest that sort of calculated the economic impact and also the reduction of fossil fuels into the atmosphere as well. And it was extraordinary. But getting into my research, I really like to talk about these examples because I think they help people understand that we actually have quite the ability to model indigenous peoples in terms of their food system. So let me just give an example. One is the Heiltsuk of British Columbia. They are a wonderful group that I've had the honor of visiting, and they hand plant kelp forests along the coastlines of British Columbia. And these kelp forests provide the surface area upon which the herring fish can lay their eggs or lay their roe. And this roe is a nutrient dense, eggs, a lot of calories packed into there. And they actually are able to support not just the human population. One of their delicacies is herring on hemlock. So they'll also dip hemlock boughs into the water, and the herring will just plaster the whole thing with eggs. But it also feeds the salmon and the killer whale and the wolves and throughout the food web. So in this, and they come every February, the herring come to lay the roe. And so this basically creates or embodies what I've been sort of saying is like humans can be a keystone species. And a keystone species is one in which if you were to remove it from the system, a lot of the system or all of the system would collapse. For example, the beaver creating these dams, creating these habitats, sustains so many different things, the moose that come to drink, the fish, the bear that eat the fish, etc. So human beings can be a keystone species. And I would even argue that we were created to be a keystone species. That is our purpose. And indigenous peoples throughout the world always say, Creator put us here to take care of this biome. This is our kuleana, as the Hawaiians say. This is our responsibility. And that's why it hurts so much when oil companies come in or mining companies come in or water extraction companies come in, because we feel like we failed our job of protecting what Creator put us here to do. So the word for human being in the Yoruba language is chosen one. And I thought at first that sounded funny, but when he explained it, he said, no, we are chosen by Creator to be the protectors of that land. We are chosen by creators to be the stewards of that land. And all of a sudden, for me personally, it started to make sense, that we were given these big brains for a reason. We are not misfits of creation. We are not a plague upon the earth. We are, as the Healthsuk have exemplified, 100% able to not just not hurt the earth, but to, as white folks are calling it now, regenerate the earth. And I just laugh because, we've been talking about this for a long time, but now regeneration is popping off and it's wonderful. And I'm glad. And also, another example is in Kentucky. In Kentucky, the Shawnee have essentially done wonderful things with chestnut trees. We know through fossilized pollen records that these records are actually showing how chestnut forests appeared out of nowhere 3,000 years ago in Kentucky, and were sustained for up until 1830, when sort of the process of colonization started to break down the indigenous management system of the chestnut groves. And as some of us on the call might know, the American chestnut is almost extinct. It collapsed due to a blight, due to mismanagement. So what's also interesting is that along with this chestnut pollen, and this will be my last example, was a lot of fossilized charcoal. So there's a wonderful book called Forgotten Fires that actually details state by state. They go through these colonial nations, colonial states as we know them now, like New York, Montana, New Mexico, literally every state, all of the anthropological evidence and the paleoecological evidence of how indigenous peoples used controlled burns, which Clover might know a lot about in Australia. The folks over there do it too, to actually regenerate soil systems, turning this expired plant tissue, these grasslands, into ash, which then soaks into the soil and stimulates microbial activity, increases the water filtration rates, and brings these nutrients, these potassium, nitrogen, into the soil through that ash, and also eliminates competing vegetation. So we would open up the canopy so that the deer would not only have nutrient-dense grass to eat, but would have a place to walk through. And we would also use those fires to keep the chestnut, the old growth chestnut, far apart, and eliminate like close vegetation between to prevent the hopping of diseases from tree to tree. One of my elders says the rule of thumb was 13 trees per acre. So what we now see when we look at an American forest is nothing what it looked like when indigenous peoples were managing it. And I think this is just an example of how, because of the racism built into the scientific fields, which say, oh, Indians were too stupid to do that. We haven't really paid homage to the ways in which indigenous peoples have actually managed whole groves of forests. The oyster population in Chesapeake Bay, they sustainably harvested oysters out of the Chesapeake Bay for 10,000 years, augmenting in size the oysters. But under American management, the oyster has collapsed in less than 300 years in the Chesapeake Bay. So these regenerative systems are really exciting to me. And on one hand, they teach us it's been done before, we can do it again. On the other hand, we can't simply mimic Indigenous peoples. We have to restore leadership of Indigenous peoples to their lands. We can't just say, oh, that's cool, I'm gonna buy this 5,000 acres and do a regenerative project here. It's like, no, doing a regenerative project on stolen land might be regenerating the soil, but you're not regenerating history. You're not regenerating those social issues that Paul said are at the core of our climate crisis. You're not regenerating relationships between humanity. And I think those need to be regenerated concurrently as we regenerate ecological systems. So that's sort of the overall message I'm trying to give, is not just, wow, Indigenous peoples did this, but also let's bring them back to their own land so that they can do it again. And let's also create space for non-Native people too, to live here as guests, as honored guests, rather than entitled immigrants.
That's beautiful. I want to give a little follow-up example to that, which is that when the peoples of the Midwest, you know, as the emerging Americans conquered and subjugated these native nations, they signed treaties, and the treaties were horrible and forced on them, but they still have treaty rights. And the people of the Midwest have often rights to fish and hunt and forever to yield from the harvest, you know, from the land. And so the waters around Duluth were incredibly toxic and polluted. And in the 1970s, starting in the 1970s, and the people there used to live off of wild rice. And the wild rice no longer is a very pollution sensitive species, so it doesn't grow in polluted waters. And make a long story short, the waters were declared in the 1980s under a Superfund Act and theoretically cleaned, so cleaned of the toxicity that the iron industry and others had brought. But the American scientific and environmental groups only had a view of removing toxicity. They didn't have a view of regenerating, of taking it forward, of what true healing was. And so the tribe sued and said, we have this right to harvest wild rice, and until we can harvest wild rice, this system ain't working for us. And they won in court, and that pushed forward an entirely different view of what ecosystems restoration was, which is not just removing the toxicity. And now today there's wild rice. There's not enough, but the wild rice is coming back. And so that, so part of it, I think there's much more that needs to be done, but there are treaty rights that if they can get affirmed and then used in their true intent, might be of help.
Agreed. There's a saying in the Native community, we have all these treaty rights and we're still not treated right. There's just so many treaties that aren't, but I think it's wonderful when we do bring them to courts and they are actually adhered to. And I hope that happens much more.
So John, I want to go back to you because Clover had a fantastic quote. It's easier to imagine the end of civilization than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Clover, who said that? You quoted, you named
Mark Fisher.
Mark Fisher. Who's Mark Fisher?
I will pass that to John.
Okay, John, talk to us about Mark Fisher. But then I know Mark Fisher was working in Africa on regeneration. I don't know if it's the same one. But then, John, so I'd love to hear from you. So what do we do about capitalism? Tell us who Mark Fisher is, and then tell what do we do about capitalism.
I don't know Mark Fisher, so this is becoming a ping pong game with about 15 different players.
Okay, so forget that part.
We must find, no, if anyone could find out and put it in the chat.
Oh, it's in the Zoom. Somebody put it in the chat. It's there.
So I know him as an author. He wrote a book called Capitalist Realism.
Got it.
Yeah.
So the answer to your question, Jonathan, is I simply don't know. I think capitalism is a very loose label that's applied to all sorts of different forms of wealth creation and destruction. And you know, it comes in so many styles of ownership, so many different scales. What goes in a state-owned capitalist enterprise versus in India or China or Saudi Arabia is so different from what happens in some of the best, for example, family-owned businesses or whatever. And I think in a way, capitalism and its use as a concept it's lazy in the sense that there was a moment where capitalist style limited company approaches and so on evolved in places like Holland and so on, and the big sort of East India combines and so on. But I think capitalism is challenged now in ways that it hasn't been for a very long time. It was on a roll for a long time because there was a huge world out there to be exploited. And what I think now is beginning to happen is that, in fact, I'm doing a TEDx thing a couple of days from now. I just talk about the chrysalis economy, the way in which what was a very rapacious set of organisms are now being increasingly squeezed in this sort of Anthropocene period of ours, where everything that we do has an impact. And now it's increasingly coming back to us because relative to the scale of our activities, the Earth is much smaller than it once was. The one thing I would say about capitalism, and I don't champion it in any way, I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by how these styles of thinking, these mindsets are evolving. And it's a generational process. I mean, each new generation of so-called capitalists brings very different thinking to bear. But I'm fascinated by it because it does evolve, and it doesn't evolve uniformly. It doesn't evolve in the same way all around the world, but it does. And it's one of its great strengths is that it can evolve, as many of the state-driven equivalents showed very clearly that they couldn't. So I think it's a distraction sometimes to talk about capitalism, but if it comes to mean the use of multiple capitals, you know, Paul has been doing work on that for longer than I can almost remember, then that's, I think that's progress. But when I think about ordinary people in business, the sort of people, I mean, they're extraordinary in some ways, but the normal people I deal with business, they do not have the capacity to process 8 capitals all at one time. They may know something that sort of integrates across those in the way that, say, indigenous peoples might once have done. But I think we're a big step away from people talking about regeneration in business to the point where they would properly practice it in the way that all of the people in this conversation would recognize as genuinely refreshing and recharging and restoring and regenerating the systems on which we all rely. So it's a complicated question. I don't have an easy answer to it, I'm afraid.
Do you see models of regenerative business that inspire you or that at least begin to show the next step?
Well, I'm partly prowling through Paul's book looking for some of those. And I think that the problem very often is that where we can find these examples, they tend to be peculiar, by which I mean they're sort of very individual. And very often it goes back to an individual, a family, a tribe, a people, or whatever, who've done this because it felt right to them, rather than because it was sort of hugely profitable. And the reason why I struggle with your question about capitalism is we tend to think, when we think about capitalism as its main organs, we think about financial institutions, and we think about, you know, the major multinational corporations and so on. But we should also think about markets, and markets are social constructs, and we evolve them over long periods of time. And then we forget that they even exist. We just do what we think it's appropriate for us to do. We buy what we want to buy and so on. But we're not very skilled as a species at constructing markets rather than just businesses that deliver the sort of outcomes that we need and want. And I think there was a moment in the Second World War in 1944 with the Bretton Woods where, for totally different reasons, people were forced to think about what sort of market future do we want. and came up with a series of approaches, which I think served us in very limited ways incredibly well. And the question in my mind is, do we need the plague, the depression, the war to force us to the point where we can seriously think about some of this stuff? Or is there something going on around us now with the cultural changes, demographic changes, and so on, which might get us there a little bit sooner and without the violence, which as a species we seem to tend to need to sort of force us to think through these things through adequately.
You know, what's interesting is because of COVID, although there is a selfishness that comes with our approaches to COVID, at some point we all recognize that every human being must be vaccinated for us all to be safe. And that although countries are trying to take care of Me Too first, they're trying to take care of, they recognize, I've seen a much more rapidly than we saw in the AIDS crisis, a rapid recognition that the health of all is dependent upon the health of all. And again, I remember there was a lot of financial negotiation about donor countries and what we're going to do about the AIDS crisis. And it seems that we have been less, the money's been less the issue in this idea of vaccinating all, but it's been kind of this, we know we have to do it, we know we have to do it. And so this may be a clue to, I love your idea about markets, that there is a market in communal well-being that we may just have gotten a glimpse of. And maybe, do you have any thoughts that we might be able to grow that?
I'm sure we could. I'm sure in some areas we will. I have been both excited and disappointed by the impact of the pandemic, in the sense that you're absolutely right. People are aware that, you know, we solve it everywhere or we don't solve it in the end anywhere. But that's driven partly by a sense that this thing is very unstable. It mutates. And if you have populations of people who continue to be infected, you've got to breed a reactor in some ways. So I don't think a lot of this is coming from altruism or whatever. It may be shaped by that, but I don't think that's where it's coming from. And to your point about, this has cost us trillions in sort of lost this, that, and the other. It's going to cost a great deal to vaccinate the world. But when you put that alongside the costs of actually stabilizing our climate, restoring the biosphere, all of that, these are orders and orders of magnitude apart. So the thing that I would love to see, which I'm not yet seeing, which I think is absolutely core to the regeneration story, is a proper sense of generational equity and generational transfers of wealth, but also of debt. And I'm not sure I'm seeing that, but others here may well be more encouraged by what they've seen happening.
Anybody have thoughts on generational equity?
I want to say one thing about capitalism. We can play capitalism with commerce, and we should not do that. Commerce is ancient, and it's built on trust and interchange. When Lewis and Clark got to the Northwest, Native Americans there had wampum, but they had necklaces made of shells from Patagonia. Okay, so that describes a extraordinary highway, not a literal highway, but of communication and interchange and understanding that was there already. And there was an exchange, and those exchanges are commerce. So commerce is ancient and sacred to me. And how it got perverted is really what capitalism is about. It's a perversion of commerce. And I think of capitalism the same way that G.K. Chesterton commented about Christianity. He said, there's nothing wrong with Christianity, it's just that it's never been tried yet. And I would say the same thing about capitalism. It's never been tried yet because it's just about monetary capital. And so money is a fiction. And it's not about natural capital. It's not about all the other forms we think of that capital take shape in. So to me, capitalism is it's not, first of all, it's a misnomer, first of all. And second of all, it's just a hook people hang things on, but it's kind of meaningless to me. What is meaningful to me is the juggernaut of of money accumulation. Now that is terrifying and horrific. And that is going on at a greater rate today than it ever has before. And so that and I think, to Lila's point, actually, you can't concentrate it the way it's being concentrated, without presaging collapse. It will collapse. There's no question in my mind.
What's so interesting to me is that the name capitalism reveals itself as the ism of capital. And capital, as you said, is a mental construct. It's just an abstract measurement system that we created. It doesn't have true inherent existence. And yet we have all these systems to store it and protect it and save it and regulate it and worship it. And so it feels to me, coming out of this conversation, that we need an ism of nature, of well-being, of thriving, that of which then commerce becomes part of the pathway to achieving it. So in effect, it's almost like having an ism of electricity versus an ism of the services that electricity creates. Does that make sense? So we're concentrating on the tool and not its.
Yeah, I would say, think about it, every ism has screwed up the world. We don't need any more isms. That's I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Even Buddhism screwed up Buddha's teachings were the science of the heart and mind. And look what happened to the Rohingya in Burma, by Buddhist mobs. Okay, so isms are toxic.
This might be off topic, or maybe it isn't. But I like the idea that commerce was ancient, and I wanted to build on that a little bit. Is what I noticed in these indigenous food systems, and I looked at a number of case studies, is that we were always feeding our food. And one of the primary ways of generating what we call food was by augmenting habitat. So habitat augmentation was what would bring the food, which were actually living beings, but just like you and I, to us. So the augmentation of healthy soils so that these chestnut trees could thrive, the augmentation of herring habitat so that the herring could come, the augmentation of grasslands through controlled burns to bring the buffalo in, the augmentation of pools so that the eels in Australia would have a place to come and reproduce. And so there's that commerce between species, and really giving to them what they needed. And that's the difference between farming, to me, and indigenous food systems. To me, farming has inherently in it this idea of extraction. Like we're farming these living beings for our benefit. And to me, that's capitalism. We're farming this mountain for copper. And when you said its name reveals itself, I thought you were going to say capitalize. Because if you look up capitalize, its synonyms are to take advantage of, to extract from. So I'm not saying that's all, we're in semantics at this point, but what I'm saying is I think there's such a beautiful way that we can be reciprocal and it's such a simple idea, it's such an ancient idea, but it's so hard for a nation that's been trained to teach them how to give. And to our nation that's been trained to self-aggrandize, to self-center, to fight for the top of the pyramid, to go back to those systems, and come to a place where we want to actually give. And so that's something that your statement, I don't know if I'd call it commerce, but I thought your statement engendered a really interesting, and it goes back to someone's question in the Q&A about how does trust figure into regeneration? That was a really interesting question. How does trust figure into regeneration? I think it has everything to do with regeneration. And to augment trust, one must augment goodwill. So anyways, I'm just rambling at this point, but thank you for letting me just share this idea that like we can feed our food, and that reciprocity, I think, is at the heart of regeneration.
Thank you. We're moving towards the end, and so I'm going to ask each one of you if there's something concluding that you want to bring to us. Mimi?
Well, I would thank everyone first and foremost for the work that they're doing in the world and what they've brought today. And also that the idea that true wealth is really what you give to the world, and the original covenant of the origin of life on earth is that you die well and you provide again. And so, if the work that we do is going to inspire change, it should always give more than what we take away. And we can create infinite substrate in a finite, confined environment if we just remember that is the one that is the one way forward. That the techno solutions that we've all pointed to are distractions from the most elegant solutions that were designed and have perpetuated the flourishing of many abundant earths that have collapsed and regenerated. It can all be done. And if you were a highly evolved civilization looking down at what we're doing right now, the solutions are very, very clear. And the only thing that really needs to change is our minds and how we use our minds to act.
Clover.
That was a very nice segue. Thank you, Mimi. The difference between being able to channel difficult emotions into action and feeling shut down by them are the stories that we subscribe to about the world and about our role in it. And I've heard universal stories talking to 8 and 9-year-olds in the classroom and also decision makers in the boardroom. And they often sound something like, I'm too small to make a difference, I don't have the skills, someone else will fix the problem, swinging in the opposite direction to the system is too broken, the problem is too late, etc. There is a vested interest from the fossil fuel industry, from the industries and people in historic seats of power who benefit from the status quo continuing to limit our imaginations, to limit the world that is possible and the role that each of us can play in creating that future. Margaret Thatcher back in the day came up with the acronym TINA, there is no alternative, right? And even now we see fossil fuel lobbies funding, doomsday kind of climate information, so that we do feel that it is too big, it's too overwhelming, it's too complex. And yet, while we might not be able to solve climate change overnight, the one thing that we can change, to Mimi's point, is our mindset. It's the stories that we write, and it's the stories that we choose to subscribe to. And one of the most empowering moments for me was when I realized that the institutions and systems that I'd inherited were inherently fluid. And in fact, they lost their power and their value so long as we stopped subscribing to them, so long as we stopped collectively saying each day, yes, I want to subscribe to this way of living. I want to divorce myself from nature. I want to buy products that distance me from the frontline communities who are worst affected by them. And when we stop placing that power in the institutions who benefit from us giving up, and take back that agency within ourselves, and when we feel nourished by that decision as well, without knowing the outcome, without knowing whether we will or won't solve the issues, that is when we ignite that fire within us, and that is when we feel that we can see and live and breathe that future that is possible. And one of the best first steps that you can take is by checking out the Regeneration website, because it so beautifully illustrates just what that future is and how each and every one of us can play a critical role in realizing it. Thank you.
Thank you. John?
Well, I was just reflecting that I've been on a ferocious learning curve throughout my life, but it's just gone through some sort of inflection point and is screaming up into the stratosphere. And what fun that is, and what a joy it is to be part of a conversation like this. We did touch earlier on social media, and I think our capacity used sensibly to use social media in a good way is an extraordinary boon. I'm learning stuff from that all the time. But I was reflecting also that if you think back to the 1930s, Joseph Goebbels used radio as a deadly weapon, and people, Myanmar was mentioned, people will use these emergent technologies. But I've always loved science fiction, and people like Teilhard de Chardin talked about the noosphere, Arthur C. Clarke talked about childhood's end. What happens when younger people start to link up and communicate in ways that the older generation don't understand? And the thing I just leave us with is that I see too much evidence that my generation, the boomers, are sort of very keen to hand this over to younger people, and they can't do that. They shouldn't do that. I think it will be extremely dangerous if they did. This is a pan-generational challenge, and we've got to address it in that way. And to do that, we've got to think differently, we've got to behave differently, but critically, we've got to do politics in different ways now. So a joy to listen to all of this. The one image that will rattle around my brain, I think probably forever, is that one of the reptilian bouncer. But I'm about to go and stick my tongue into a glass of wine. That was Paul's, for those who don't remember, for the tongue. And I'm going to have a glass of wine, but it won't be anything like Mimi's, and it won't have that sort of sense of terroir. So hopefully at some stage, however we engineer it, we will get together and meet face to face. But back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Lyla, June.
Yeah, thank you all so much for this time. And I guess I'll just end on a note of hope, not false hope, I think, is that I started out by saying that collapse was our greatest teacher. Everything from the mound builders and the Mississippian cultures to the Mayan civilizations that collapsed. Actually, they walked away from it. They decided they weren't God. And the Chacoans, where my people come from, what happened after the collapse is what's very beautiful. Because there's nothing like being humbled by your creator. There's nothing like being humbled by creation to really bring you into a more evolved state of yourself. And so people often look to native people as these guiding lights or these beacons of how to walk. And I always say, we weren't born this cool just randomly. We had to go through we had war, we had caste systems, we destroyed our environments, we went through collapse and many times. And I say that jokingly, although I do think we are very cool. But it was from after, it was those crucibles of really being humbled that we developed these things, these linguistic terms, these kinship ways of relating to one another, etc. So I really truly believe that this mass extinction, as painful and horrific as it is going to temper us into more humble, more kind, and more cooperative human beings on a global scale. For whatever that's worth, that is my prediction. And I think through this, we will no longer ever be able to say that human supremacy works, male supremacy works, white supremacy works, because clearly it has failed us. And from that, we can walk forward in a good way as better people. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, Paul. Last words.
I'm kind of stunned by all of you. The subtitle of the book came from Jonathan, by the way. Jonathan Rose was the one who suggested that when 3 years ago, I forget what it was. And so thank you, Jonathan, so much. Lyla is, I work for Lyla. She's on my board. She's a director. So I report to Lyla. And I couldn't be more pleased and honored that she accepted that position. Mimi, to me, it's just beautiful, this bringing a biologist into farming instead of farming that destroys biology. and she wrote several blogs, and I wanted to print 2 of them in the book, but I ran out of space. There's another one she published. It's so eloquent and beautiful. This sort of, it's rare, I think, but it does happen when you get somebody from the land, who has this incredible eloquence and can write so well. To Clover, I want to say, actually, what I say to everybody is that, look out, watch out. This is the most eloquent, amazing young person I have ever met, and I actually haven't met in flesh, but this way. And I had an opportunity to have Greta Thunberg write the introduction with Jane Goodall to the book, and it was offered. I chose Jane. I chose not to do Greta. And the reason is because nobody scolds the world better than Greta Thunberg, but I don't think scolding is what we need anymore. And I wish it had been Clover Hogan that I knew at that time to co-write the introduction with Jane and so forth. And finally to John, he and I have known each other for some time, and unfailingly impressed by the breadth and depth and eloquence and command that you have and your perspective. And I just want to thank you all for joining together today. Jonathan brought us together. Thank you so much. My closing comment is simply that we all know, we know that whatever you want to call it, but the impacts of a warming atmosphere and the relationship to it and the response to it will be the biggest movement in the history of humanity. I won't call it the climate movement because it's not really, but call it what you want, when an amorphous term. And it's going to be brought about by weather. And it will humble us in every way, and already is, just as Lyla pointed out. And the question is, how will we organize? How will we coalesce? How will we connect? Not literally, but what will be the connection points? And I feel that what unites us is far more important than what divides us in that circumstance. And so, going back to what Clover was saying earlier and so forth, the despair, the anxiety in the world is growing, and the number one cause of depression is lack of purpose. No question about it. To feel purposeless and that you have no purpose to anyone else and to the rest of the world. And I feel like even it's the only word we have, Lyla, but the regeneration the regeneration of the world is bringing the world back to life instead of bringing it back to death. And it's really a question of, do we want to steal the future or heal the future? And every one of us, I think, was going to come to that point in the road, that fork in the road in some way, and make a choice. And to continue down a road that we can see that's ending very soon, or a road that leads us to a place unknown, but one that has values that we can understand. And I think that bringing the world back to life brings human beings back to life. And although we can walk around and do things and buy things, we're not really in our life in some way. And we all want to come to life. And so what I love about all of you is your life, how you express your life, that you bring others to life. And I'm really looking forward to the next 20 years. It's going to be so messy and in such a difficult way, in such an extraordinary way. This is, to me, an inflection point that Lyla speaks of, and I feel like I just feel honored to know you, and I feel honored to know and to speak to this this offering that this planet has given us, that the Creator has given us. It's an offer, it's a gift, it's generosity. And thank you for being with us today, for allowing me to be with you.
Paul, Mimi, John, Clover, Lyla, June, thank you so much for this wonderful collective consciousness that we created today, and amazing conversation. And to the audience, we felt your presence too, and thank you. All the Pathways of Planetary Health forums are offered free of charge, but we love it when you support us. So you can click on a link and make a donation if you want. And the next Pathway to Planetary Health virtual event coming up is with Kerry Kennedy, who's the president of the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights. And we're going to be talking about human rights and planetary health. So thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of the day.